Welcome, weary traveler, to another journey through the gentle currents of history. Tonight, we drift back to a time when the world's greatest empire didn't collapse with thunderous applause or dramatic fanfare, but rather faded like candlelight in a dying breeze. The year is 476 CE, and you find yourself witnessing not the sudden death of Rome, but its slow, inevitable dissolution, a process that had been unfolding for generations, like the gradual erosion of a mighty cliff face by persistent, patient waves. Imagine yourself settling into the soft embrace of time itself, as we explore why survival in this crumbling world would have tested every fiber of your being. The Roman Empire, that magnificent colossus that had straddled the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years, was coming to its quiet end in the West. Not with the clash of mighty armies or the roar of conquering hordes, but with the gentle whisper of administrative collapse, the soft shuffle of abandoned streets, and the muffled sounds of a civilization slowly forgetting how to be itself. Picture, if you will, the sensation of walking through a once great city where the very stones beneath your feet remember better days. The marble columns still gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hands that had touched them in reverence or simple daily necessity. Yet something indefinable had changed in the air itself, a quality of emptiness that even the most magnificent architecture couldn't mask. The fountains still bubbled with clear water, but fewer and fewer people came to fill their vessels. The forum still echoed with voices, but they spoke in tongues that would have been foreign to Augustus, in accents that carried the music of distant forests and northern plains. Tonight, we'll walk through empty forums where marble statues still stood guard over absent crowds, peer into the lives of ordinary citizens watching their world transform beyond recognition, and discover how the very foundations of daily existence crumbled beneath the feet of those who called themselves Roman. We feel the weight of awe, uncertainty that pressed down on shoulders that had once carried the confidence of imperial citizenship, and understand how the slow dissolution of order created challenges that would test the most resourceful among us. Close your eyes now and let yourself drift into this world of twilight empire, where survival meant adapting to a reality that changed not in moments, but in the slow, inexorable passage of years. Feel the warmth of the Mediterranean sun on your face. Smell the familiar scents of olive oil and fresh bread that somehow seemed less abundant than in your grandfather's time. And hear the distant sound of voices speaking in languages that your ancestors would not have recognized as belonging to fellow Romans. The empire didn't fall in a day. It collapsed in slow motion, crushing the people underneath it. And in that crushing, we find stories of resilience, desperation, and the eternal human struggle to find meaning in a world that no longer made sense. Tonight, we become witnesses to this transformation, observers of a civilization's quiet metamorphosis into something unrecognizable, yet somehow still clinging to the proud name of Rome. The morning sun filtered through the narrow windows of your modest dwelling, casting familiar patterns of light and shadow across the worn stone floor. But as you stepped into the street, the absence hit you like a physical weight, where once the steady tramp of hobnailed boots had marked the rhythm of imperial order. Now only the soft whisper of wind through empty archways greeted your ears. Imagine yourself as a citizen of Rome in these final years, when the very concept of being Roman had become as fluid as morning mist. The legions that had once guaranteed your safety, that had made the name Roman citizen a shield against the uncertainties of the ancient world, had long since been withdrawn to defend more critical frontiers. The streets that had once bustled with the confident stride of soldiers on leave, their bronze armor gleaming in the sunlight, now hosted a different kind of visitor entirely. The absence of military presence created a vacuum that nature, as always, rushed to fill. In the growing twilight of imperial authority, bands of men with weathered faces and strange accents had begun to appear with increasing frequency. These were not the disciplined formations of Germanic foederati serving Rome, but rather loose groups of individuals who recognized no authority but their own immediate needs. They moved through the streets with the easy confidence of those who understood that the old rules no longer applied with their former certainty. Walking through your neighborhood in the early morning, you would have noticed how the character of the streets themselves had begun to change. The pavements, once meticulously maintained by teams of public slaves, now bore the subtle signs of neglect. Weeds pushed through cracks in the stone, and the once pristine marble surfaces of public buildings showed the gentle accumulation of grime that spoke of stretched resources and competing priorities. The magnificent aqueducts still brought water to the city, but the smaller distribution pipes showed increasing signs of makeshift repair patches of clay and wood where bronze fittings had once gleamed. Your morning routine would have been punctuated by encounters that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. Perhaps a group of armed men, speaking in the guttural tones of some northern dialect, would have approached your small shop with a kind of casual authority that made your pulse quicken. They were not Romans, not in any sense that your grandfather would have recognized, yet they wore scraps of Roman military equipment and claimed to serve Roman interests. The line between protector and predator had become increasingly blurred in these twilight years. The marketplaces told their own story of transformation. Where once the efficient machinery of imperial commerce had guaranteed regular supplies of goods from across the known world, now the stalls bore the uncertain stock of local production and whatever could be obtained through increasingly irregular trade routes. The spices that had once flavored the tables of even modest citizens became precious luxuries, while the reliable flow of grain from Egypt and North Africa had dwindled to a trickle that could no longer be counted upon. In this world of diminishing certainty, survival required a kind of flexibility that would have been foreign to your ancestors. The rigid social hierarchies that had once provided structure and predictability had begun to blur at the edges. Former slaves, freed by the simple dissolution of their master's ability to maintain them, wandered the streets seeking new forms of employment or protection. Some found it in the service of local strongmen who had begun to fill the vacuum left by retreating imperial authority. Others turned to less savory means of survival, adding to the general atmosphere of uncertainty that hung over daily life like a persistent fog. The streets themselves became theaters of cultural collision, where the old Roman ways met the customs of peoples who had never fully absorbed the imperial ideal. You might encounter a group of women drawing water from a public fountain, their conversation a mixture of Latin and some barbarian tongue, their children playing games that combined Roman traditions with customs imported from distant forests and steppes. The very sound of the city had changed, becoming a polyglot murmur that reflected the empire's transformation from a unified culture to a patchwork of overlapping identities. The morning ritual of commerce revealed perhaps most clearly how profoundly the world had changed. In your hand, you held coins that bore the proud profiles of emperors, their Latin inscriptions proclaiming eternal dominion over lands that no longer acknowledged Roman authority. Yet these bronze and silver discs, once the reliable medium of exchange across the known world, had become almost comically inadequate to the task of securing even the most basic necessities of life. Imagine yourself standing before a baker's stall in the early morning hours, the familiar aroma of fresh bread mingling with the less pleasant sense of a city whose infrastructure strained under the weight of uncertainty. The baker, a man whose family had served the neighborhood for 3 generations, looked at the handful of coins you offered with the weary expression of someone who had grown tired of explaining the same uncomfortable truth day after day. The imperial currency that had once commanded respect from Britain to the Black Sea now carried the weight of doubt, its value fluctuating not by the hour, but by the rumor. The debasement of the coinage had been proceeding for generations, each emperor finding it necessary to reduce the precious metal content of the imperial currency to fund increasingly desperate military campaigns and administrative expenses. By the time of Rome's final years in the West, the silver denarii that had once contained nearly pure precious metal had been diluted to the point where their metallic content was worth less than the bread they were supposed to purchase. The bronze coins that made up the bulk of daily transactions had become so debased that merchants weighed them rather than counted them. And even then, the transaction required a complex negotiation that would have bewildered citizens of earlier generations. The baker's scale told the story of economic collapse more eloquently than any historian's account. Where once a single loaf of bread might have cost a few bronze coins, now the same loaf required a careful measurement of metal that often exceeded its own weight. The irony was not lost on those who lived through this transformation. The empire that had once boasted of its golden age now struggled to maintain the basic fiction that its currency retained meaningful value. But the true genius of survival in this economic wasteland lay not in accumulating more coins, but in understanding the new forms of value that had begun to emerge from the ruins of the old system. Barter had returned with a vengeance, not as the primitive exchange of a less sophisticated age, but as the practical response of intelligent people to the failure of their monetary system. The baker who accepted your debased coins might simultaneously negotiate a separate transaction involving olive oil, pottery, or even promises of future labor. The bread itself had become a kind of currency, more reliable than the imperial coinage and more immediately useful than promises of future payment. A loaf that once represented the basic unit of daily sustenance now served as a medium of exchange in its own right. The practice of cutting bread into precise fractions, thirds, quarters, even smaller portions, had evolved from simple portion control into a sophisticated system of fractional currency. A third of a loaf might secure a small jar of oil, while 2/3 could be exchanged for a day's worth of vegetables or a small piece of cloth. This transformation of bread from simple sustenance to economic instrument reflected the broader collapse of imperial economic structures. The great bakeries that had once supplied bread to the masses through imperial subsidies had largely ceased to function as the grain. Supply from Egypt and North Africa became increasingly unreliable. In their place, smaller neighborhood bakeries struggled to maintain production, using whatever grain could be obtained through local networks of trade and barter. The psychological impact of this economic transformation cannot be overstated. For generations, Romans had derived a sense of security and identity from their participation in a monetary economy that spanned continents. The ability to carry coins minted in Rome and use them to purchase goods in Britain, Gaul, or Syria had been one of the most tangible benefits of imperial citizenship. Now that same citizenship had become almost meaningless in practical terms, while the coins that had once symbolized imperial power served primarily as reminders of promises that could no longer be kept. Walking through the markets of Rome in these final years, you would have witnessed scenes that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. Merchants haggling not over prices, but over the basic acceptability of imperial currency. Customers arriving with bundles of goods to trade rather than purses full of coins. The gradual emergence of new forms of value based on immediate utility rather than abstract promises of imperial backing. The grain dole, that ancient promise of the Roman state to provide basic sustenance to its citizens, had become a cruel joke. The distributions that still occurred were irregular and insufficient, forcing even those who had once relied on imperial largesse to develop alternative strategies for survival. The crowds that gathered at the distribution points were smaller than in previous generations, not because need had diminished, but because many had lost faith in the system's ability to deliver on its promises. In the workshops and small businesses that lined the narrow streets, you could observe the birth of economic arrangements that would have seemed foreign to earlier generations of Romans. Craftsmen who had once sold their goods for standardized imperial currency now engaged in complex negotiations involving multiple forms of payment. A sandal maker might accept partial payment in coins, partial payment in raw materials, and partial payment in promises of future services. These arrangements required a level of personal trust and local knowledge that had been unnecessary in the height of imperial economic integration. The wealthy had adapted to these conditions by diversifying their holdings into forms of value that could survive the collapse of imperial currency. Land, livestock, and stored goods became more important than accumulated coins. The great houses that had once displayed their wealth through elaborate furnishings and exotic imports now demonstrated their prosperity through their ability to maintain reliable access to basic necessities. The conspicuous consumption of earlier generations had given way to a more practical focus on security and sustainability. Yet even in this transformed economic landscape, traces of the old imperial system persisted like ghostly reminders of former glory. Certain merchants still accepted imperial currency at face value, either from loyalty to old traditions or from calculation that the imperial system might yet recover. Some transactions still followed the ancient patterns of Roman commercial law, even when the currency involved bore little resemblance to the coins that had originally inspired those legal frameworks. The tax collectors who still appeared periodically in the neighborhoods provided perhaps the most surreal reminder of the gap between imperial pretensions and economic reality. These officials, often accompanied by small groups of armed men, continued to demand payment of taxes in imperial currency, even as that same currency failed to command acceptance in the local markets. The negotiations that followed these demands often resembled theatrical performances, with both sides participating in a ritual that everyone understood to be largely meaningless, yet which no one felt empowered to abandon entirely. For the ordinary citizen trying to survive in this economic wasteland, success required the development of skills that would have been foreign to earlier generations. The ability to assess the true value of debased coinage, to negotiate complex barter arrangements, to maintain relationships with multiple trading partners who might accept different forms of payment. These became essential survival skills in a world where the old certainties had dissolved into uncertainty and improvisation. The morning brought with it a familiar dread that had become as regular as sunrise, the possibility that today might be the day when representatives of imperial authority appeared at your door with demands that made no sense in the context of your daily reality. The taxation system, that vast bureaucratic apparatus that had once been the circulatory system of empire, continued to function like a ghost that had not yet realized it was dead. Picture yourself in the small courtyard of your modest dwelling, tending to the practical tasks that occupied your days, when the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of visitors whose very presence embodied the contradictions of your age. The tax assessor, accompanied by his small retinue of clerks and guards, carried with him the faded authority of an empire that could no longer guarantee the most basic services to its citizens, yet continued to insist upon their fiscal obligations with the persistence of habit rather than the force of logic. The men who stood before you bore the external symbols of imperial office, the bronze badges, the rolled papyrus documents sealed with wax, the measured cadences of official Latin, yet their actual power derived not from the distant emperor in Constantinople, but from their immediate ability to make your life difficult through purely local means. They represented a bureaucracy that had become parasitic, extracting resources without providing the services that had once justified its existence. The demands they presented were often surreal in their disconnection from economic reality. Taxes assessed in imperial gold coins that had not circulated in your region for years. Obligations calculated according to property values that bore no relationship to the actual capacity of land to generate income in an age of declining agricultural productivity and disrupted trade routes. Requirements for military service in legions that existed primarily on paper, or for contributions to public works projects that had been abandoned due to lack of resources. Yet the most absurd aspect of these encounters was not the demands themselves, but the elaborate ritual of negotiation that surrounded them. Both you and the tax assessor understood that the system no longer functioned as designed, yet neither felt empowered to acknowledge this truth directly. Instead, You engaged in a complex dance of partial compliance, creative interpretation, and mutual face-saving that allowed the machinery of imperial administration to continue turning, even as it produced increasingly meaningless results. The assessor might accept payment in kind grain, oil, cloth at artificial exchange rates that bore little relationship to market values. He might reduce the assessment in exchange for promises of future payment that both parties knew would never be honored. He might even accept symbolic compliance, a token payment that acknowledged the principle of taxation without fulfilling its practical purpose. These arrangements satisfied the bureaucratic need to maintain the appearance of function while accommodating the economic reality that the old system had ceased to work. But perhaps more challenging than the persistence of imperial taxation was the daily navigation of a society that had become a forced mixture of peoples, customs, and expectations that had never been designed to coexist in close proximity. The neighborhoods of Rome in these final years resembled nothing so much as a vast experiment in cultural collision, where the careful hierarchies and ethnic distinctions that had once provided social structure had been scrambled beyond recognition. Walking through your district in the afternoon, you would encounter scenes that would have bewildered your grandparents. A group of Gothic women drawing water from a Roman fountain, their children playing in the dust with toys that combined barbarian craftsmanship with classical Roman forms. A shopkeeper conducting business in 3 languages simultaneously, switching between Latin, Germanic dialects, and the patois that had emerged from the mixing of tongues. A funeral procession that combined Roman ceremonies with customs imported from forests beyond the Rhine, creating hybrid rituals that belonged fully to neither tradition. This cultural mixing had not occurred through choice or gradual assimilation, but through the brutal necessities of survival in a world where the old boundaries no longer held. Germanic families had settled in Roman neighborhoods not through conquest, but through the simple expedient of occupying abandoned properties whose Roman owners had fled or died. Roman families had adapted barbarian customs not from admiration, but from the practical recognition that these customs often proved more effective than Roman traditions in navigating the challenges of a collapsing civilization. The linguistic landscape of the city had become a testament to this forced integration. The pure Latin of classical education had given way to a polyglot street language that incorporated Germanic loan words, adapted barbarian grammatical structures, and created new vocabulary to describe experiences that classical Latin had never needed to address. Children grew up trilingual by necessity, equally comfortable cursing in Gothic and praying in Latin, switching between linguistic systems as easily as they moved between the different cultural quarters of their neighborhood. Yet this apparent harmony masked deep tensions that could erupt without warning into violence or social chaos. The Roman citizen who had lost his ancestral property to Gothic settlers harbored resentments that could smolder for years before exploding into acts of revenge or sabotage. The Germanic warrior who found himself treated as a second-class citizen despite his military prowess chafed under social arrangements that denied him the respect he felt he had earned through service to Rome. The established Roman families who had managed to maintain their status viewed the social mixing around them with a combination of disgust and fear that occasionally manifested in attempts to reassert the old hierarchies through violence or legal manipulation. The religious landscape provided another arena for this complex negotiation between tradition and necessity. The Christian churches that had become the dominant religious institutions of the empire found themselves ministering to congregations that included recent converts whose understanding of Christianity was colored by pagan traditions from across the barbarian world. Roman Christians, who had grown up with centuries of theological development, encountered Germanic Christians whose faith incorporated elements of forest religion and warrior culture that seemed almost heretical to more traditional believers. The bishops and priests who served these mixed congregations became, by necessity, skilled diplomats as much as spiritual leaders. They learned to craft sermons that could speak simultaneously to Roman sensibilities and barbarian experiences, to conduct rituals that honored Christian doctrine while accommodating the emotional needs of people whose spiritual lives had been shaped by very different traditions. The Christianity that emerged from this process was neither purely Roman nor purely barbarian, but something new that carried elements of both traditions while belonging fully to neither. In the markets and workshops, this cultural mixing produced innovations that would have been impossible under the rigid social structures of earlier imperial periods. Roman craftsmen learned techniques from barbarian artisans, creating hybrid styles of metalwork, pottery, and textile production that combined classical proportions with Northern European decorative traditions. Germanic merchants adapted Roman commercial practices to serve trade networks that extended into regions that had never been fully integrated into the imperial economy. Yet the absence of systematic cultural integration meant that these innovations remained localized and fragmentary. Unlike the earlier periods of Roman expansion, when conquered peoples were gradually assimilated into a coherent imperial culture, the cultural mixing of the 5th century occurred without central planning or institutional support. The result was a patchwork of local accommodations that created remarkable diversity within individual neighborhoods, while failing to generate any overarching sense of shared identity or common purpose. The legal system provided perhaps the most complex arena for navigating these cultural collisions. Roman law, with its elaborate procedures and abstract principles, encountered Germanic legal traditions that emphasized personal honor, collective responsibility, and immediate resolution of disputes through violence or compensation. The magistrates who attempted to adjudicate disputes between Roman and Germanic residents found themselves creating hybrid legal procedures that satisfied neither tradition fully while providing enough justice to maintain minimal social peace. The pale September light filtering through the shuttered windows of the imperial villa found a scene that would have been unimaginable to the great emperors of Rome's golden age. In a modest bedchamber that bore little resemblance to the opulent quarters of the Palatine Hill, a boy of perhaps 14 years stirred beneath woolen blankets that, while fine, carried none of the purple that had traditionally marked imperial sleeping quarters. This was Romulus Augustulus, whose very name seemed to mock the diminished state of the office. He held Romulus after the legendary founder of Rome. Augustulus meaning Little Augustus, a diminutive that his enemies had coined, but which had stuck with the cruel persistence of childhood nicknames. Imagine the peculiar weight of awakening each morning to the knowledge that you bore a title that had once commanded the allegiance of millions, yet now held authority over a territory that had shrunk to little more than the immediate vicinity of Ravenna. The boy emperor, for he remained a child, in all but the legal fiction of his imperial status, faced each day with the burden of maintaining the elaborate ceremonies of imperial dignity while possessing none of the actual power that had once given those ceremonies meaning. The morning ritual of imperial awakening had been compressed into a shadow of its former grandeur. Where once a complex hierarchy of servants, officials, and courtiers would have orchestrated the emperor's emergence into the day, now a handful of attendants performed the necessary functions with the quiet efficiency of those who understood that they were maintaining a performance rather than serving actual power. The purple-bordered toga that marked imperial status was brought forward with appropriate ceremony, yet everyone present understood that this garment had become more costume than symbol of authority. Young Romulus himself navigated these contradictions with the adaptability of youth, yet also with a growing awareness that his position had become increasingly precarious. The tutors who attempted to educate him in the traditional imperial curriculum rhetoric, law, military strategy, philosophy must have struggled to make their lessons relevant to a world where imperial authority extended barely beyond the villa's walls. How do you teach the art of ruling an empire to a boy whose empire exists primarily in the minds of those who maintain the fiction of its continued existence? The correspondence that arrived each morning told the story of imperial dissolution more clearly than any historical analysis. Letters from provincial governors who no longer bothered to request imperial approval for their decisions. Reports from military commanders who had declared their independence or transferred their allegiance to barbarian kings. Diplomatic communications from Constantinople that treated the Western Empire as a client state rather than an equal partner in imperial authority. Each piece of parchment that crossed the imperial desk carried with it the weight of territories lost, authority abandoned, power transferred to others. Yet perhaps most poignant was the correspondence that did not arrive, the silence from regions that had once formed the backbone of imperial administration. Britain had been silent for decades. Its Roman population either absorbed into Anglo-Saxon kingdoms or retreated into isolated enclaves that maintained Roman identity without Roman political connection. Gaul communicated through barbarian intermediaries when it communicated at all. Spain had become a patchwork of Visigothic domains that acknowledged imperial authority only when convenient. Even Italy itself had been carved into spheres of influence that owed more to local strongmen than to imperial appointment. The boy emperor's daily routine required him to maintain the elaborate fiction that these lost territories remained part of his domain, that the barbarian kings who ruled them were his loyal foederati, that the collapse of imperial administration represented temporary setbacks rather than permanent transformation. He signed documents appointing governors to provinces that no longer acknowledged imperial authority. He issued edicts regarding taxation in territories whose revenues had been redirected to barbarian treasuries years earlier. He received reports from generals who commanded armies that existed primarily on paper, their supposed legions having long since been incorporated into barbarian war bands or disbanded for lack of pay. The most complex aspect of young Romulus's position was his relationship with Odoacer, the Germanic chieftain who had become the true power behind what remained of the Western imperial throne. Odoacer maintained the elaborate courtesy of a loyal general serving his emperor, yet everyone understood that this relationship had been inverted. The emperor served at the pleasure of his supposed subordinate. The daily interactions between the nominal ruler and his actual master required a delicate choreography of mutual face-saving that must have been exhausting for an adolescent trying to understand his place in this strange arrangement. Odoacer's genius lay in his understanding that the complete elimination of imperial authority would create more problems than it solved. The various barbarian kingdoms that had established themselves on former imperial territory still found it convenient to maintain the fiction that they ruled as representatives of legitimate imperial authority. The populations they governed, particularly in the more Romanized areas, retained enough attachment to imperial identity that outright abolition of the empire might provoke resistance or rebellion. By maintaining young Romulus as a figurehead, Odoacer could exercise practical authority while avoiding the political complications that would have resulted from a formal declaration of imperial extinction. The boy emperor's education in practical politics came not through formal instruction, but through daily observation of how power actually functioned in his transformed world. He learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when Odoacer was merely consulting him as a courtesy, and when the Germanic chieftain actually required some form of imperial legitimation for his decisions. He developed the ability to perform imperial dignity convincingly, while understanding that his performance was valued primarily for its utility to others, rather than for any inherent authority it represented. The young emperor's meals provided daily reminders of his reduced circumstances. Where the imperial table had once featured delicacies imported from across the known, world exotic spices from India, rare wines from distant provinces, fruits and vegetables from climate zones that spanned continents. Now the imperial cuisine reflected the limitations of local production and disrupted trade networks. The food was still prepared with care and served with appropriate ceremony, yet it bore little resemblance to the legendary abundance that had marked imperial dining in earlier generations. The servants who attended these meals represented another aspect of the empire's transformation. Many were Germanic in origin, their service to the imperial household representing not the traditional career advancement that had once attracted ambitious Romans to imperial service, but rather the practical arrangement of individuals who had found employment in one of the few remaining institutions that maintained some semblance of stability and prosperity. They performed their duties with competence and even devotion, yet their loyalty was personal rather than institutional. They served Romulus the person rather than the office of emperor that he supposedly embodied. The afternoons brought the most challenging aspect of imperial performance, the necessity of receiving visitors and conducting the ceremonies that maintained the appearance of continued imperial function. Local officials still found it useful to receive imperial confirmation of their appointments, even when everyone understood that such confirmation carried no practical authority. Merchants still sought imperial licenses for activities they would pursue regardless of official approval. Religious leaders still requested imperial endorsement of their positions and decisions, despite knowing that such endorsement provided little protection against the political realities of their local situations. These ceremonies required young Romulus to master a complex theatrical performance that acknowledged the gap between appearance and reality without explicitly acknowledging that gap. He learned to grant appointments with appropriate imperial gravity, while understanding that the appointees would exercise their functions according to local power, relationships rather than imperial authority. He developed the ability to issue edicts with convincing authority, while knowing that compliance would depend on the personal influence of those who chose to enforce his decisions rather than on any systematic imperial administration. The most difficult aspect of these performances was maintaining consistency with the elaborate fiction that the Western Empire remained a functioning political entity. Each ceremony required careful coordination to ensure that the emperor's words and actions supported the broader narrative of continued imperial authority, even when that narrative had become increasingly difficult to sustain. A casual remark that acknowledged the true state of imperial power could undermine the entire carefully constructed facade. Yet excessive insistence on imperial prerogatives that no longer existed could make the performance laughably unconvincing. As evening approached and the day's ceremonies concluded, young Romulus faced the private reality of his position, the loneliness of bearing a title that isolated him from normal human relationships while providing none of the compensating satisfactions of actual power. He was too important to form casual friendships with his servants, yet too powerless to command the respect that would have made formal relationships with other nobles satisfying. He existed in a social limbo that reflected the broader political limbo of the institution he represented. The boy's private chambers became a refuge where he could temporarily set aside the burden of imperial performance. Yet even in solitude, he remained trapped by the circumstances of his birth and elevation. His father, Orestes, had placed him on the throne as part of a political calculation that had already begun to unravel by the time young Romulus understood what was happening to him. The purple that should have been the symbol of ultimate authority had become instead the mark of ultimate vulnerability. He was too visible to hide from the consequences of political failure, yet too powerless to prevent that failure from occurring. In the quiet moments before sleep, listening to the sounds of the villa settling into nighttime stillness, the last emperor of the West might have contemplated the strange fate that had made him both the culmination and the conclusion of a political tradition that stretched back over 1,000 years. He was the final link in a chain that connected him to Augustus, to Julius Caesar, to all the great figures whose names had defined the concept of imperial authority. Yet he was also the first to bear that title while knowing with certainty that it would not outlive him. The transformation that ended the Western Roman Empire came not with the crash of armies or the burning of palaces, but with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the most successful revolutions are those that barely feel like revolutions at all. Odoacer, whose name would forever mark the boundary between the ancient world and whatever came after, approached the dissolution of imperial authority with the methodical patience of someone who had spent years observing the machinery of power and learning exactly which components were essential and which were merely decorative. Picture the morning when the final act of this long drama began to unfold not in the great throne rooms of legend, but in the modest, administrative chambers of Ravenna, where the business of governing what remained of the Western Empire had been reduced to a series of practical accommodations between Roman forms and barbarian realities. The Germanic chieftain who held effective control over Italy had spent months, perhaps years, preparing for this moment through a series of careful moves that gradually shifted the balance of power while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to imperial authority. Odoacer's genius lay in his understanding that power in the 5th century came not from dramatic gestures or military conquest, but from the patient accumulation of practical authority over the daily functions that kept society operating. While young Romulus performed the ceremonies of imperial dignity, Odoacer had quietly assumed responsibility for the unglamorous but essential tasks of administration, collecting taxes, paying soldiers, maintaining roads, securing food supplies, negotiating with local officials who needed someone to provide the stability and resources that imperial authority could no longer guarantee. The Germanic chieftain had observed the failures of previous barbarian leaders who had attempted to replace Roman authority through direct conquest or violent overthrow. These approaches had consistently failed because they destroyed the administrative systems that they sought to control, leaving the conquerors with territories that could not be effectively governed and populations that remained hostile to foreign rule. Odoacer's innovation was to preserve the forms of Roman authority while gradually assuming their substance, creating a transition so gradual that many participants barely noticed when it occurred. The critical moment came when the young emperor's father, Orestes, finally overreached in his attempts to maintain some vestige of real imperial authority. The confrontation between Orestes and Odoacer represented not just a personal power struggle, but the final collision between the old imperial system and the new realities of post-imperial governance. Orestes, despite his own barbarian origins, had committed himself to maintaining the fiction of Roman imperial authority in its traditional form. Odoacer, with perhaps greater wisdom, understood that this fiction had become not just useless, but actively harmful to effective governance. The military campaign that resolved this conflict was brief and decisive, yet it unfolded with a restraint that revealed Odoacer's understanding of his broader political objectives. Rather than engaging in the kind of destructive warfare that had characterized earlier barbarian invasions, Odoacer conducted operations that targeted specific military and political objectives, while minimizing damage to the civilian population and administrative infrastructure that he intended to inherit. His soldiers were disciplined, his strategy was focused, and his victory was achieved with the minimum force necessary to eliminate organized resistance. The death of Orestes removed the last figure who might have provided young Romulus with the political and military support necessary to maintain some vestige of independent imperial authority. Yet even in this moment of complete victory, Odoacer demonstrated the political sophistication that would characterize his entire approach to governance. Rather than executing the boy emperor or subjecting him to public humiliation, the Germanic chieftain treated him with the courtesy due to a legitimate ruler who had simply been overtaken by circumstances beyond his control. The deposition itself was conducted with a ceremony that honored both Roman legal traditions and the practical necessities of political transition. Young Romulus was not stripped of his dignity or subjected to the kind of ritual humiliation that had marked some previous imperial depositions. Instead, he was invited to participate in a carefully choreographed process that allowed him to abdicate with honor while providing Odoacer with the legitimacy that came from receiving imperial authority through apparently voluntary transfer rather than naked conquest. The boy emperor's final speech as Western Roman emperor was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that acknowledged the realities of the situation. while maintaining the dignity of all parties involved. Speaking with a composure that suggested careful coaching, young Romulus explained that the changed circumstances of the age required new forms of governance that could better serve the needs of the Italian people. He praised Odoacer's virtues as a leader and expressed confidence that the transfer of authority would result in greater prosperity and security for all concerned. The most symbolically significant moment came with the handling of the imperial regalia, the crown, scepter, and other physical symbols of imperial authority that had been passed down through generations of emperors. Rather than claiming these symbols for himself, Odoacer made the unprecedented decision to return them to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor as the sole legitimate heir to imperial authority, while claiming for himself only the more modest title of King of Italy. This gesture represented political genius of the highest order. By returning the imperial regalia to Constantinople, Odoacer avoided the complications that would have resulted from claiming imperial authority for himself, while simultaneously solving the problem of what to do with symbols that had become politically inconvenient. The Eastern Emperor could accept the regalia as acknowledgement of his theoretical authority over all former imperial territories, while Odoacer could exercise practical authority over Italy without challenging the broader imperial system that still provided legitimacy for barbarian rulers throughout former imperial territories. The ceremony of returning the regalia was conducted with elaborate attention to protocol that demonstrated Odoacer's understanding of symbolic politics. The imperial crown and scepter were not simply shipped to Constantinople by commercial cargo, but were entrusted to a formal embassy that could present them to the Eastern Emperor with appropriate dignity. The accompanying letter, dictated by Odoacer, but presented as the collective voice of the Roman Senate and people of Italy, explained that the West no longer required its own emperor because Odoacer's capable leadership had made such division of authority unnecessary. The Eastern Emperor's response to this unprecedented situation revealed the broader transformation of imperial politics that Odoacer's actions had precipitated. Rather than attempting to reassert direct control over Italy or denouncing Odoacer as a usurper, Constantinople chose to grant the Germanic chieftain official recognition as patricius and legitimate ruler of Italy. This response acknowledged the practical reality that the Eastern Empire lacked the resources to reconquer the West, while providing both parties with the legal fiction necessary to maintain face in their dealings with other powers. The transition period that followed the formal deposition demonstrated Odoacer's commitment to administrative continuity over revolutionary change. Roman legal procedures continued to function under his authority, staffed by many of the same officials who had served the imperial administration. Tax collection continued according to established procedures, though the revenues now supported Odoacer's government rather than flowing to Constantinople. The complex system of municipal administration that had developed over centuries of imperial rule was preserved and adapted to serve the new political reality. Yet beneath this surface continuity, fundamental changes were occurring that would reshape the political landscape of the former Western Empire. The Germanic warriors who formed the core of Odoacer's support required rewards for their loyalty, and these rewards inevitably came at the expense of the traditional Roman elite who had previously monopolized land ownership and political authority. The redistribution of property and political power that occurred during this period was conducted with relative restraint, yet it represented a social revolution that permanently altered the character of Italian society. The Roman Senate, that ancient institution which had provided continuity of governance through centuries of imperial transformation, found itself adapting to yet another change in the source of ultimate authority. The senators who chose to remain in Italy and work with Odoacer's government discovered that their traditional privileges and responsibilities could be maintained, but only through accommodation with the new reality of barbarian rule. Those who could not accept this accommodation faced exile or irrelevance, while those who embraced it found opportunities for continued influence within the transformed political system. The city of Rome itself experienced this transition as a gradual shift in the center of political gravity rather than a sudden catastrophic change. The great monuments and public buildings that had symbolized imperial power remained intact, yet they gradually acquired new meanings as they were adapted to serve the needs of post-imperial society. The forums that had once echoed with debates about imperial policy now hosted negotiations between Roman administrators and Germanic officials. The palaces that had housed imperial bureaucrats became the residences of barbarian nobles, who were slowly learning to navigate the complexities of Roman administrative procedures. For the ordinary citizens who witnessed these changes, the end of the Western Roman Empire came not as a single dramatic event, but as the gradual recognition that the familiar patterns of imperial governance had been replaced by new arrangements that seemed to function more effectively than the old system had in its final years. The streets were safer under Odoacer's disciplined rule than they had been under the chaos of the late imperial period. Tax collection was more predictable and less oppressive than it had become under emperors, who lacked the resources to maintain effective administration. The food supply was more reliable because Odoacer's government could negotiate more effectively with the barbarian kingdoms that controlled the agricultural regions it supplied. Italian cities. The psychological impact of this transition varied enormously depending on individual circumstances and personal attachments to imperial identity. For some Romans, particularly those whose families had built their fortunes and status on imperial service, the end of the Western Empire represented a catastrophic loss of meaning and purpose that could never be fully replaced. For others, particularly those who had struggled under the dysfunctional imperial administration of the late 5th century, Odoacer's efficient governance provided relief from years of uncertainty and exploitation. The children who grew up during this transition period would become the first generation of post-imperial Italians, inheriting a world where Roman and Germanic traditions had begun to merge into something that belonged fully to neither culture, but drew strength from both. They would speak Latin that had been enriched by Germanic vocabulary, follow laws that combined Roman legal principles with barbarian customs, and worship in churches that had adapted Christian doctrine to accommodate the spiritual needs of mixed populations. Picture yourself waking up in the city of Rome on a gray morning in the year 476. The sun filters weakly through the shutters of your modest apartment, casting long shadows across cracked plaster walls that haven't seen fresh paint in years. Outside, the streets that once echoed with the measured footsteps of legions now lie largely empty, save for the occasional shuffle of desperate feet and the distant sound of something being dragged across stone. You are a Roman citizen, a title that your grandfather wore with pride. That once opened doors across 3 continents and commanded respect from Britain to Egypt. But now, as you pull on clothes that have been mended too many times, that citizenship feels as substantial as smoke. The purple stripe on your toga, if you even own one anymore, has faded to the color of old bruises. The first challenge of your day is the most basic: finding something to eat. The grain dole that once fed the masses of Rome has become sporadic, unreliable. Sometimes the ships arrive from North Africa with their precious cargo of wheat. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're intercepted by pirates who sell their contents to the highest bidder. The bureaucrats who once managed this system with clockwork precision have either fled to Constantinople, joined the barbarian courts, or simply disappeared into the chaos of the times. When bread is available, it's different now. The loaves are smaller, darker, mixed with barley and sometimes sawdust to stretch the dwindling supplies. A single loaf that once cost a few copper coins now demands payment in silver, if you can find anyone willing to accept Roman currency at all. More often, the bakers want payment in goods: a knife, a piece of jewelry, anything that holds value in this new economy where money has become a cruel joke. You make your way through streets that tell the story of decline in cracked stone and crumbling mortar. The Forum, once the beating heart of the world, now hosts more weeds than senators. Marble columns that once supported the weight of empire now support nothing but the occasional vine that has found purchase in their cracks. The Senate House still stands, but its debates have become hollow echoes of former glory, discussing matters that no longer matter to anyone who holds real power. The absence of soldiers is perhaps the most unsettling change. For centuries, the sight of Roman legions had been as constant as sunrise, their bronze armor gleaming, their standards proudly displayed, their very presence a reminder that you lived under the protection of the greatest military force in history. Now, those same streets are patrolled by men who speak Germanic languages, who wear different armor, who follow different gods. They are not necessarily hostile, but they are not yours. They owe their allegiance to commanders with names like Odoacer and Ricimer, not to Rome itself. These new guardians of order come from tribes that your ancestors would have called barbarians. Yet here they are, maintaining what passes for peace in a city that can no longer defend itself. They collect taxes in the name of authorities who may or may not exist. They enforce laws that change depending on which commander currently holds sway. They represent a new reality that you struggle to understand, let alone accept. The coins in your purse, if you have any, tell their own story of collapse. The gold solidi that once held their value across the known world are now clipped, debased, mixed with base metals, until they're worth a fraction of their face value. The silver denarii have become so thin you can see light through them. Local commanders have taken to minting their own currency, creating a bewildering array of coins that may or may not be accepted beyond the next city gate. Trade, the lifeblood of Roman prosperity, has become a dangerous gamble. The roads that once carried merchants safely from Scotland to Syria are now haunted by bandits who may be former soldiers, displaced farmers, or simply desperate people trying to survive. The Pax Romana, that long peace that allowed commerce to flourish, has given way to a chaos where every transaction carries the risk of violence. You witness the forced mixing of cultures that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. Gothic children play in the streets alongside Roman ones, their parents eyeing each other with the wariness of strangers forced to share the same space. In the markets, you hear Latin spoken with heavy Germanic accents, Latin words mixed with Visigothic phrases, creating a linguistic hybrid that would have horrified Cicero. The old social hierarchies that gave structure to Roman life had begun to blur and shift. Senators find themselves bowing to barbarian kings. Slaves discover that their Gothic masters follow different rules than their Roman ones. Freedmen navigate a world where the legal frameworks that define their status are being rewritten by people who barely understand them. Religion, too, has become a complex landscape of competing faiths and conflicting loyalties. The old gods of Rome still have their followers, but they worship in whispers and shadows. Christianity has fractured into different sects, each claiming to represent the true faith. The barbarian tribes bring their own beliefs, their own rituals, their own interpretations of the divine. In this religious marketplace, you must choose carefully. Your spiritual allegiance might determine your physical survival. The very concept of law has become fluid. Roman law, that great achievement of legal thinking that once governed an empire, now competes with tribal customs, military decree, and simple expedience. A crime committed in the morning might be judged by Roman standards. The same crime committed in the evening might fall under Gothic law. Justice has become a matter of timing and location rather than consistent principle. Housing reflects the new reality of Roman life. The great domus of the wealthy still stand, but they're often divided among multiple families. Their courtyards turned into workshops, their reception halls converted into dormitories. The insulae, those multi-story apartment buildings that house the masses, have become even more crowded as refugees from the countryside seek safety behind the city as increasingly symbolic walls. Water, that fundamental necessity that Roman engineering had made abundant, has become less reliable. The aqueducts still function, but they require constant maintenance that no one seems responsible for providing. Fountains that once flowed continuously now run dry for days at a time. The public baths, those centers of social life, are forced to close more often than they open. Their heating systems too expensive to maintain. The nights bring different fears than they once did. Darkness in Rome had always held dangers. But they were familiar dangers. Thieves, drunks, the occasional political violence that came with power struggles. Now the nights bring uncertainty about whether the morning will bring new rulers, new laws, new threats. You sleep with one ear open, not knowing whether the sounds outside your window represent the normal rhythms of urban life or the approach of forces that could change everything overnight. Educational systems that once trained administrators for the empire now struggle to teach basic literacy. The schools that produced the bureaucrats, lawyers, and teachers who kept Roman civilization functioning have lost their purpose in a world where traditional Roman careers no longer exist. Children grow up learning different languages, different customs, different ways of understanding the world than their parents knew. The postal system, that marvel of Roman organization that once carried messages across continents with remarkable speed and reliability, has deteriorated into a collection of local networks that may or may not connect. Letters that once traveled from Rome to London in a matter of weeks now disappear into the void, their contents lost to bandits, weather, or simple neglect. Economic life has become a series of improvisations. The complex financial instruments that once facilitated trade across the empire have given way to simpler, more immediate forms of exchange. Banking, in any meaningful sense, has collapsed. Credit, that foundation of commercial expansion, has become impossible to obtain. Every transaction must be completed immediately, with goods or precious metals changing hands on the spot. The libraries that once preserved the accumulated wisdom of centuries have become vulnerable to fire, flood, and simple neglect. Books that represented the only copies of important works disappear when buildings are abandoned or repurposed. The intellectual life that once flourished in Rome begins to contract, preserved only in the minds of scholars who may themselves be forced to flee at any moment. Medical care, never abundant for the common people, has become even more scarce as physicians flee to more stable regions or join the courts of barbarian rulers. The public health measures that had made Roman cities relatively safe places to live have broken down. Disease spreads more quickly through populations that lack the resources to maintain basic sanitation. As you navigate this transformed world, you realize that being a Roman citizen in 476 CE means being a survivor of something that no longer truly exists. You carry the memory of what Rome was, but you live in the reality of what it has become. The empire that once seemed eternal has revealed itself to be as mortal as any individual life, and you are witnessing its final, labored breaths. The rhythm of daily life has become a constant adaptation to circumstances beyond your control. Each morning brings new challenges, new uncertainties, new reminders that the world you knew is slipping away. Yet you continue, because continuation is what human beings do, even when the foundations of their civilization crumble beneath their feet. This is the texture of collapse, not the dramatic crash of Hollywood imagination, but the gradual erosion of everything that once seemed permanent. In the midst of this transformation, ordinary people like you face the fundamental human challenge of finding meaning, safety, and purpose in a world that no longer offers the certainties that previous generations took for granted. Now, let us turn our attention to the boy who would become history as Footnote, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. His name was Romulus Augustulus, and in the cruel irony that history sometimes provides, he bore the name of Rome's founder and the title of Rome's first emperor. Yet he would preside over neither the beginning nor the height of Roman power, but over its quiet, almost anticlimactic end. Picture, if you will, a child of perhaps 13 or 14 years old, thrust into a role that had once commanded the allegiance of millions. Romulus Augustulus, the Little Augustus, as his contemporaries mockingly called him, never asked to be emperor. He was placed on the throne in 475 CE by his father, Orestes, a man who had served under Attila the Hun before switching sides to pursue Roman ambitions. The boy emperor was, from the very beginning, a puppet whose strings were pulled by forces far greater than himself. Imagine the imperial palace in Ravenna, where the Western Roman court had retreated decades earlier, fleeing the political chaos of Rome itself. The building still maintained some of its former grandeur marble columns, still gleamed in the Italian sunlight. Mosaics still told stories of Roman triumph on walls and floors. Tapestries still hung in chambers where emperors had once made decisions that shaped the world. But there was a hollow quality to this magnificence now, like a theater set maintained for a play that no one truly wanted to see. In this palace, a child sat on a throne that had once been occupied by men like Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius. But where those emperors had commanded legions that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, Romulus Augustulus could barely command the respect of his own guards. His empire, such as it was, consisted of little more than Italy itself, and even that was contested territory, filled with barbarian federates who acknowledged Roman authority only when it suited their purposes. The boy emperor's daily routine would have been a strange mixture of imperial ceremony and powerless frustration. He would wake in chambers decorated with the symbols of world-spanning authority, surrounded by courtiers who performed the elaborate rituals of imperial protocol, while knowing that their emperor's actual power extended barely beyond the palace walls. He would hold audiences where petitioners still approached with the formal deference due to a Roman emperor, even though everyone present understood that any real decisions would be made by his father or by the barbarian commanders who held the true power. Orestes, the boy's father, had been a Roman general who served the empire faithfully until he perceived an opportunity to seize power for his family. He had deposed the previous emperor, Julius Nepos, and placed his own son on the throne, believing that he could rule through the boy while maintaining the fiction of legitimate imperial succession. It was a calculation that revealed both ambition and a fundamental misunderstanding of how completely the world had changed. The barbarian federates who had been serving Rome as military allies had grown increasingly restless. They had been promised land, payment, and integration into the imperial system, but the Western Empire's capacity to fulfill these promises had steadily diminished. These warriors, many of them from Germanic tribes, had families to support and followers to reward. They had served Rome faithfully, but their patience was not unlimited. Their leader was a man named Odoacer, a warrior of mixed Germanic heritage who had risen through the ranks of barbarian commanders serving Rome. He was not the savage that Roman propaganda might have described, but rather a pragmatic leader who understood both military necessity and political reality. He had spent years observing the internal conflicts that plagued the Western Empire, watching as emperors rose and fell with bewildering frequency, each claiming legitimacy while possessing little actual authority. In the late summer of 476 CE, Odoacer's patience finally reached its end. His followers had been promised lands in Italy as payment for their military service, but Orestes had refused to honor these commitments. The refusal was perhaps understandable from a Roman perspective. Giving away Italian territory to barbarian settlers would have been seen as an unacceptable surrender of Roman sovereignty. But from the barbarians' perspective, it was a betrayal of agreements that had been sealed with blood and service. The confrontation that followed was less a dramatic battle than a quiet revolution. Odoacer's forces moved against Orestes with the methodical efficiency of professional soldiers who understood that their cause was just and their victory inevitable. They cornered Orestes at Pavia, where the boy emperor's father made his final stand. The battle was brief, decisive, and fatal for Orestes, who who died still believing that Roman authority could be maintained through force and political maneuvering. With his father dead and his protector gone, young Romulus Augustulus found himself alone in a palace that had become his prison. The barbarian commanders who now controlled Italy were not particularly interested in harming a child, but they were also not interested in maintaining the fiction of his imperial authority. The boy who had been emperor for less than a year was about to discover that history had no more use for him. Odoacer's approach to the situation revealed both his political sophistication and his understanding of symbolic power. He could have simply killed the boy emperor, as had been done to many previous rulers in times of political transition. Instead, he chose a more subtle, and in many ways, more devastating course of action. He would allow Romulus Augustulus to live, but he would strip away the symbols and substance of imperial power, reducing the last emperor to what he had always been, a child who had been thrust into circumstances beyond his understanding or control. The deposition ceremony, when it came, was conducted with a restraint that was almost merciful. There were no crowds baying for blood, no dramatic declarations of revolutionary intent. Instead, there was simply a quiet meeting in the imperial palace, where Odoacer informed the boy emperor that his reign was over. The imperial regalia, the purple robes, the diadem, the scepter, all the physical symbols of Roman authority, were carefully removed and prepared for a journey that would take them far from Italy. But here is where the story takes a turn that reveals the complexity of the political situation. Odoacer did not claim the imperial title for himself. He understood that ruling as a barbarian emperor would create unnecessary conflicts with the Eastern Roman Empire, which still maintained considerable power from its capital at Constantinople. Instead, he chose to return the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor, Zeno, acknowledging the theoretical unity of the Roman Empire, while maintaining practical control over Italy. This decision was a masterpiece of political theater. By returning the regalia to Constantinople, Odoacer was saying, in effect, that the Western Empire no longer needed its own emperor, because it was returning to the unified rule of a single Roman emperor in the East. He was presenting his takeover not as a barbarian conquest, but as a restoration of imperial unity. The Eastern Emperor could maintain his dignity and his theoretical authority over all Roman territories, while Odoacer could rule Italy as the Eastern Emperor's representative. The journey of the imperial regalia from Ravenna to Constantinople was itself a symbolic funeral procession for the Western Roman Empire. The purple robes that had clothed emperors since Augustus, the crown that had adorned the heads of men who had commanded the loyalty of millions, the scepter that had represented authority over 3 continents. All of these traveled eastward, carried by envoys who understood that they were witnessing the end of an age. For young Romulus Augustulus, the deposition meant a strange kind of freedom. He was granted a pension and allowed to retire to a villa in Campania, where he could live out his days as a private citizen. The boy who had been emperor for less than a year would spend the rest of his life as a historical curiosity, a living reminder of how completely the world had changed. Some sources suggest he lived well into the 6th century, watching from his comfortable exile as the Byzantine Empire reconquered parts of Italy, as new barbarian kingdoms rose and fell. As the world continued to evolve in ways that made his brief reign seem like something from a distant and almost mythical past, the silence that followed the deposition was perhaps more profound than any dramatic declaration might have been. There were no proclamations announcing the end of the Western Roman Empire, no formal ceremonies acknowledging that 1,000 years of Roman dominance had come to an end. Instead, there was simply the quiet acceptance of a new reality, the gradual understanding that the world had changed in ways that could not be undone. In Rome itself, the news of the deposition was received with the weary resignation of a population that had witnessed too many political upheavals to be shocked by one more. The Romans had seen emperors come and go with bewildering frequency over the previous century. They had watched as the seat of power moved from Rome, to Milan to Ravenna. As barbarian commanders gained influence, as the empire's borders contracted and its authority diminished. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus was simply the final step in a process that had been unfolding for generations. The journey of the imperial regalia from Ravenna to Constantinople was itself a symbolic funeral procession for the Western Roman Empire. The purple robes that had clothed emperors since Augustus, the crown that had adorned the heads of men who had commanded the loyalty of millions, the scepter that had represented authority over 3 continents. All of these traveled eastward carried by envoys who understood that they were witnessing the end of an age. For young Romulus Augustulus, the deposition meant a strange kind of freedom. He was granted a pension and allowed to retire to a villa in Campania, where he could live out his days as a private citizen. The boy who had been emperor for less than a year would spend the rest of his life as a historical curiosity, a living reminder of how completely the world had changed. Some sources suggest he lived well into the 6th century, watching from his comfortable exile as the Byzantine Empire reconquered parts of Italy, as new barbarian kingdoms rose and fell. As the world continued to evolve in ways that made his brief reign seem like something from a distant and almost mythical past. The silence that followed the deposition was perhaps more profound than any dramatic declaration might have been. There were no proclamations announcing the end of the Western Roman Empire, no formal ceremonies acknowledging that 1,000 years of Roman dominance had come to an end. Instead, there was simply the quiet acceptance of a new reality, the gradual understanding that the world had changed in ways that could not be undone. In Rome itself, the news of the deposition was received with the weary resignation of a population that had witnessed too many political upheavals to be shocked by one more. The Romans had seen emperors come and go with bewildering frequency over the previous century. They had watched as the seat of power moved from Rome to Milan to Ravenna, as barbarian commanders gained influence, as the empire's borders contracted and its authority diminished. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus was simply the final step in a process that had been unfolding for generations. The administrative machinery of empire, such as it was, continued to function under new management. Tax collectors still made their rounds, though they now served different masters. Courts still heard cases, though they increasingly applied barbarian law alongside Roman precedent. Roads still carried traffic, though they were protected by Gothic and Hunnic guards rather than Roman legions. The transition from imperial to barbarian rule was, in many ways, less dramatic than the internal conflicts that had plagued the empire for decades. Yet beneath this surface continuity lay a profound transformation. The legal fiction that had maintained Roman authority, the idea that all power derived from the Senate and people of Rome, that emperors ruled by virtue of their position within a continuous governmental tradition stretching back to Augustus, had been quietly abandoned. The new rulers of Italy derived their authority from military force and political pragmatism, not from constitutional theory or historical precedent. The Christian Church, which had become increasingly influential throughout the later empire, found itself navigating this transition with characteristic adaptability. Bishops who had served under Roman emperors now found themselves serving under barbarian kings, many of whom were themselves Christians, though often followers of Arian Christianity rather than the Orthodox Catholic faith that had become dominant in the Western Empire. The Church's survival strategy involved maintaining its spiritual authority while accommodating itself to new political realities. For the common people of Italy, the change in rulers was less significant than the ongoing challenges of daily survival. They had always been subject to the whims of distant authorities, whether those authorities wore Roman purple or barbarian furs. What mattered more was whether the new rulers could maintain order, protect trade, and ensure that food continued to flow from the countryside to the cities. In these practical matters, Odoacer's administration proved at least as competent as its imperial predecessors. The intellectual classes faced a more complex adjustment. Scholars, teachers, And writers who had built their careers on the assumption of Roman continuity now had to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about politics, culture, and identity. Some fled to Constantinople, where they could continue to serve a Roman emperor. Others adapted to the new circumstances, finding ways to serve barbarian rulers while preserving what they could of Roman learning and tradition. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus marked not just the end of the Western Roman Empire, but the beginning of a new understanding of how political authority could be constructed and maintained. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged from the empire's collapse would create their own forms of legitimacy, blending Roman administrative practices with tribal customs, Christian theology with warrior culture, creating hybrid institutions that would shape European development for centuries to come. Deep beneath the streets of modern Rome, in chambers that have not seen daylight for 15 centuries, lie secrets that continue to tantalize archaeologists and historians. The treasures of the Roman Empire gold beyond imagination, artifacts of immeasurable cultural value, documents that could rewrite our understanding of the ancient world vanished during the empire's final centuries. Hidden away by desperate people who hoped that better days would return, that the chaos would pass, that Rome would rise again and reclaim its stolen glory. Let us descend into this world of lost riches, following the shadows of those who buried their most precious possessions in the dark earth, sealing them away from the grasping hands of invaders, tax collectors, and the simple entropy of a civilization in collapse. The story of Rome's missing treasures is not merely one of gold and silver, though there was certainly plenty of both. It is a story of how people respond when everything they value, their culture, their identity, their very way of life, comes under threat. The Great Sack of Rome by Alaric and his Visigothic forces in 410 CE marked the beginning of the end for many of the city's ancient treasures. But this was not the chaotic, destructive raid that popular imagination might conjure. Alaric was no mere barbarian chieftain, leading a horde of savage warriors. He was a sophisticated military commander who had served in the Roman army, who understood the value of what he was taking, and who conducted his occupation of Rome with a calculated precision that maximized both his political gains and his material rewards. Picture the scene as Alaric's forces entered the Eternal City. The massive bronze doors of the great temples still gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, but behind them, priests and temple servants worked frantically to hide the most sacred and valuable objects. In the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the ancient center of Roman religious life, priests carefully wrapped golden statues in cloth and lowered them into specially prepared hiding places beneath the temple floor. The great golden shield of Mars, said to have fallen from heaven during the reign of Numa Pompilius, disappeared into a secret chamber whose location was known only to a few high-ranking religious officials. The process of concealment had been refined over centuries of political instability. Roman aristocrats had long experience in hiding their wealth during civil wars, proscriptions, and changes of regime. They had developed sophisticated techniques for creating hidden chambers, for disguising entrance points, for ensuring that valuable objects could survive periods of chaos and be recovered when stability returned. What they could not have anticipated was that this particular period of instability would prove to be permanent, that the Rome they knew would never return to reclaim what they had hidden. In the great libraries of Rome, scholars worked with desperate urgency to preserve the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The Library of Trajan, with its collection of nearly 1 million scrolls and codices, became the scene of frantic activity as librarians selected the most important texts for concealment. They could not save everything. The sheer volume of material made that impossible, but they could preserve representative samples of Roman literature, history, science, and philosophy. Entire sections of the library were walled up, their contents sealed behind false walls that were designed to blend seamlessly with the existing architecture. The selection process must have been agonizing. Which works of Livy deserved preservation? Which scientific treatises contained knowledge that could not be afforded to lose. Which historical documents provided irreplaceable insights into Rome's past? The librarians who made these decisions were essentially choosing which aspects of Roman civilization would survive and which would be lost forever. They worked by candlelight, knowing that time was running short, knowing that each choice they made would echo through the centuries. Among the documents that vanished during this period were the complete works of authors whose names we know only from fragments and references in surviving texts. The lost books of Livy's monumental history of Rome, which covered the period from the city's founding to the Augustan age, disappeared into hidden archives. The complete works of Sallust, the great historian of the late Republic, were carefully wrapped and sealed away. Technical manuals describing Roman engineering techniques, military tactics, and administrative procedures were hidden in chambers beneath government buildings. But it was not only books and scrolls that disappeared. The imperial treasuries, accumulated over centuries of conquest and taxation, represented wealth on a scale that defies modern comprehension. The treasury of Saturn, which served as the central repository for the Roman state's gold and silver reserves, contained not merely coins, but works of art, ceremonial objects, and tribute from conquered peoples spanning 3 continents. Consider the crown jewels of conquered kingdoms, collected over centuries of Roman expansion. The diadem of Cleopatra, seized after the Battle of Actium, had been preserved in the imperial treasury for nearly 5 centuries. The golden treasures of the Gallic chieftains, taken during Caesar's conquest of Gaul, filled entire chambers with their barbaric splendor. The silver and gold vessels looted from the Temple of Jerusalem during the Jewish wars gleamed alongside artifacts from British, Germanic, and African kingdoms. As the political situation in Rome deteriorated, these treasures began to disappear in carefully planned operations. Imperial officials, understanding that the traditional structures of government were collapsing, took measures to ensure that the wealth of the empire would not fall into the hands of barbarian invaders or be squandered by usurping emperors. They created hidden depositories, often in locations that were sacred or symbolically significant, places where they believed the treasures would be safe until legitimate authority could be restored. The Vatican Hill, not yet the seat of papal power but already sacred to Christians, became the site of numerous secret burials. Christian leaders, working in cooperation with sympathetic Roman officials, created underground chambers where both imperial treasures and Christian relics could be preserved together. The irony was not lost on contemporaries, the wealth of pagan Rome being protected by the very religious movement that had once been persecuted by Roman authorities. The catacombs beneath Rome, originally created as Christian burial sites, were expanded and modified to serve as treasure repositories. The existing network of tunnels provided an ideal foundation for creating hidden storage areas that could be accessed through seemingly innocent religious observances. Pilgrims visiting the tombs of Christian martyrs unknowingly walked above chambers filled with Roman gold. But the most significant disappearances occurred in the great palaces of the Roman elite. Aristocratic families who had accumulated wealth over generations faced the terrible choice between fleeing with what they could carry and leaving everything behind. Many chose a middle course, burying their most precious possessions in the hope that they or their descendants would someday return to reclaim them. The Palatine Hill, where the imperial palaces had stood for centuries, became honeycombed with secret chambers. Excavations in modern times have revealed evidence of hasty burials, walls that were clearly built to conceal something, floors that show signs of being repeatedly dug up and replaced, architectural anomalies that suggest the existence of hidden spaces. But the treasures themselves remain elusive, protected by the very secrecy that was meant to preserve them. One of the most tantalizing mysteries involves the personal treasury of the Emperor Honorius, who ruled the Western Empire during the early 5th century. Historical sources describe vast quantities of gold and precious objects that were stored in the imperial palace at Ravenna. When the capital was threatened by barbarian forces, This treasury was reportedly moved to a secure location, but no reliable record exists of where it was taken or by whom. The movement of treasures was not limited to Rome itself. Throughout the Italian peninsula, wealthy landowners and city officials created their own hidden repositories. In the Po Valley, archaeological evidence suggests that numerous villas were modified to include secret storage areas. In southern Italy, where Greek cultural influences remained strong, treasure hoards were often buried in locations associated with ancient religious sites, following Greek traditions of sacred burial. The process of concealment often involved elaborate ritual elements that were designed to both protect the treasures and ensure their eventual recovery. Objects were not simply buried randomly, but were placed according to specific patterns that had religious or magical significance. Protective amulets were included with treasure hoards. Inscriptions were carved to ward off thieves or invoke divine protection, and complex systems of markers were created to guide legitimate recoverers to the hidden wealth. Many of these markers have survived, though their meaning has been lost. Throughout central Italy, archaeologists have discovered stone markers with cryptic inscriptions, coins buried in specific patterns, and architectural elements that seem to serve no functional purpose, but may have been intended as guides to hidden treasures. The symbols carved into these markers often combine Christian imagery with older Roman religious motifs, suggesting that the treasure hiders were drawing on multiple traditions in their efforts to protect their wealth. The artistic and cultural treasures that disappeared during this period represented losses that went far beyond their material value. Sculptures by the greatest artists of antiquity, paintings that depicted lost historical events, musical instruments whose designs embodied centuries of technical development, all vanished into hiding places where they have remained for 15 centuries. These losses represent gaps in our understanding of ancient culture that can never be completely filled. Among the most significant artistic losses were the great bronze statues that adorned Roman public spaces. These monumental works, many of them depicting emperors, gods, or allegorical figures, were too large to hide easily, but too valuable to leave exposed. Some were disassembled and buried in pieces, with the intention of eventual reassembly. Others were melted down and recast into more portable forms, though this process often destroyed their artistic value, even as it preserved their material worth. The imperial regalia that was not sent to Constantinople also disappeared during this period. Crowns, scepters, ceremonial armor, and other symbols of imperial authority were hidden by officials who hoped that a legitimate emperor would someday return to claim them. These objects were not merely valuable in material terms. They were the physical embodiments of Roman political and religious authority, and their loss represented a symbolic as well as practical end to the imperial system. Religious treasures faced particular complex fates during the empire's collapse. Christian artifacts were often hidden alongside pagan treasures, as both represented valuable resources that needed protection from barbarian raiders. The mixing of Christian and pagan treasures in the same hiding places reflected the complex religious landscape of late Roman society, where old and new belief systems continued to coexist despite official Christian dominance. The fate of Jewish treasures seized during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE adds another layer to this story. These objects, which had been displayed in Roman temples and treasuries for centuries, disappeared during the late imperial period. Some sources suggest they were hidden by Roman officials who respected their religious significance, while others indicate they may have been secretly returned to Jewish communities. The truth remains unknown, adding to the mystery surrounding Rome's lost treasures. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed tantalizing hints about the locations of some lost treasures, but the very sophistication of Roman concealment methods continues to frustrate recovery efforts. Ground-penetrating radar has identified anomalies beneath Roman sites that suggest the presence of hidden chambers. But accessing these spaces often proves impossible without damaging the archaeological sites above them. The same respect for historical preservation that drives archaeological research also limits the aggressive excavation methods that might be needed to recover hidden treasures. The legal complexities surrounding treasure recovery in modern Italy create additional obstacles. Italian law regarding archaeological finds is designed to prevent the looting of historical sites, but it also makes legitimate scholarly investigation difficult. Any significant discovery must be reported to authorities, and the lengthy bureaucratic processes that follow often discourage the kind of systematic search that might be needed to locate major treasure hoards. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Rome's lost treasures is the realization that some hiding places were never meant to be permanent. Many Romans who buried their wealth intended to return within months or years to reclaim it. They created elaborate security measures, not to preserve their treasures for posterity, but to protect them during what they hoped would be a temporary period of chaos. The fact that they never returned speaks to the completeness of the transformation that overcame Roman civilization. The artistic and cultural treasures that disappeared during this period represented losses that went far beyond their material value. Sculptures by the greatest artists of antiquity, paintings that depicted lost historical events, musical instruments whose designs embodied centuries of technical development, all vanished into hiding places where they have remained for 15 centuries. These losses represent gaps in our understanding of ancient culture that can never be completely filled. Among the most significant artistic losses were the great bronze statues that adorned Roman public spaces. These monumental works, many of them depicting emperors, gods, or allegorical figures, were too large to hide easily, but too valuable to leave exposed. Some were disassembled and buried in pieces, with the intention of eventual reassembly. Others were melted down and recast into more portable forms, though this process often destroyed their artistic value, even as it preserved their material worth. The imperial regalia that was not sent to Constantinople also disappeared during this period. Crowns, scepters, ceremonial armor, and other symbols of imperial authority were hidden by officials who hoped that a legitimate emperor would someday return to claim them. These objects were not merely valuable in material terms. They were the physical embodiments of Roman political and religious authority, and their loss represented a symbolic as well as practical end to the imperial system. Religious treasures faced particular complex fates during the empire's collapse. Christian artifacts were often hidden alongside pagan treasures, as both represented valuable resources that needed protection from barbarian raiders. The mixing of Christian and pagan treasures in the same hiding places reflected the complex religious landscape of late Roman society, where old and new belief systems continued to coexist despite official Christian dominance. The fate of Jewish treasures seized during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE adds another layer to this story. These objects, which had been displayed in Roman temples and treasuries for centuries, disappeared during the late imperial period. Some sources suggest they were hidden by Roman officials who respected their religious significance, while others indicate they may have been secretly returned to Jewish communities. The truth remains unknown, adding to the mystery surrounding Rome's lost treasures. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed tantalizing hints about the locations of some lost treasures, but the very sophistication of Roman concealment methods continues to frustrate recovery efforts. Ground-penetrating radar has identified anomalies beneath Roman sites that suggest the presence of hidden chambers. But accessing these spaces often proves impossible without damaging the archaeological sites above them. The same respect for historical preservation that drives archaeological research also limits the aggressive excavation methods that might be needed to recover hidden treasures. The legal complexities surrounding treasure recovery in modern Italy create additional obstacles. Italian law regarding archaeological finds is designed to prevent the looting of historical sites, but it also makes legitimate scholarly investigation difficult. Any significant discovery must be reported to authorities, and the lengthy bureaucratic processes that follow often discourage the kind of systematic search that might be needed to locate major treasure hoards. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Rome's lost treasures is the realization that some hiding places were never meant to be permanent. Many Romans who buried their wealth intended to return within months or years to reclaim it. They created elaborate security measures not to preserve their treasures for posterity, but to protect them during what they hoped would be a temporary period of chaos. The fact that they never returned speaks to the completeness of the transformation that overcame Roman civilization. The artistic and cultural treasures that disappeared during this period represented losses that went far beyond their material value. Sculptures by the greatest artists of antiquity, paintings that depicted lost historical events, musical instruments whose designs embodied centuries of technical development, all vanished into hiding places where they have remained for 15 centuries. These losses represent gaps in our understanding of ancient culture that can never be completely filled. Among the most significant artistic losses were the great bronze statues that adorned Roman public spaces. These monumental works, many of them depicting emperors, gods, or allegorical figures, were too large to hide easily, but too valuable to leave exposed. Some were disassembled and buried in pieces, with the intention of eventual reassembly. Others were melted down and recast into more portable forms, though this process often destroyed their artistic value, even as it preserved their material worth. The imperial regalia that was not sent to Constantinople also disappeared during this period. Crowns, scepters, ceremonial armor, and other symbols of imperial authority were hidden by officials who hoped that a legitimate emperor would someday return to claim them. These objects were not merely valuable in material terms. They were the physical embodiments of Roman political and religious authority, and their loss represented a symbolic as well as practical end to the imperial system. Religious treasures faced particular complex fates during the empire's collapse. Christian artifacts were often hidden alongside pagan treasures, as both represented valuable resources that needed protection from barbarian raiders. The mixing of Christian and pagan treasures in the same hiding places reflected the complex religious landscape of late Roman society, where old and new belief systems continued to coexist despite official Christian dominance. The fate of Jewish treasures seized during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE adds another layer to this story. These objects, which had been displayed in Roman temples and treasuries for centuries, disappeared during the late imperial period. Some sources suggest they were hidden by Roman officials who respected their religious significance, while others indicate they may have been secretly returned to Jewish communities. The truth remains unknown, adding to the mystery surrounding Rome's lost treasures. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed tantalizing hints about the locations of some lost treasures, but the very sophistication of Roman concealment methods continues to frustrate recovery efforts. Ground-penetrating radar has identified anomalies beneath Roman sites that suggest the presence of hidden chambers. But accessing these spaces often proves impossible without damaging the archaeological sites above them. The same respect for historical preservation that drives archaeological research also limits the aggressive excavation methods that might be needed to recover hidden treasures. The legal complexities surrounding treasure recovery in modern Italy create additional obstacles. Italian law regarding archaeological finds is designed to prevent the looting of historical sites, but it also makes legitimate scholarly investigation difficult. Any significant discovery must be reported to authorities, and the lengthy bureaucratic processes that follow often discourage the kind of systematic search that might be needed to locate major treasure hoards. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Rome's lost treasures is the realization that some hiding places were never meant to be permanent. Many Romans who buried their wealth intended to return within months or years to reclaim it. They created elaborate security measures not to preserve their treasures for posterity, but to protect them during what they hoped would be a temporary period of chaos. The fact that they never returned speaks to the completeness of the transformation that overcame Roman civilization. These conversations reveal the extent to which the church has become not merely a spiritual institution, but a practical alternative to the collapsed structures of imperial government. The bishops and priests who gather at the villa's table are not simply religious leaders, but administrators, judges, diplomats, and social workers who must address the full range of human needs in their communities. Their theological training provides them with a framework for understanding their responsibilities, but they must also develop practical skills that were never part of traditional clerical education. The presence of barbarian guests at the bishop's table creates particularly complex dynamics. These men represent the new military and political elite, but their cultural background and religious beliefs often differ significantly from those of their Roman hosts. Some are Christians, though often followers of Arian theology that Orthodox Christians consider heretical. Others remain pagan, though they may be sympathetic to Christianity or willing to convert for political reasons. Still others practice syncretic beliefs that combine Christian elements with traditional tribal religions. The bishop must navigate these religious differences with exceptional diplomatic skill. He cannot compromise essential Christian doctrines, but he also cannot afford to alienate the barbarian leaders, whose cooperation is essential for the survival of his community. He uses his classical rhetorical training to find common ground, emphasizing shared values while avoiding contentious theological issues. He draws on biblical precedents for accommodation with foreign rulers, citing examples of how the early church had survived and thrived under pagan emperors. The barbarian guests, for their part, approach these dinners with their own agenda and concerns. They need to understand the Christian communities they now rule, to assess the loyalty and usefulness of their Roman subjects, and to determine how Christian institutions can be integrated into their own systems of governance. They listen carefully to the theological discussions, not necessarily because they are interested in Christian doctrine, but because they understand that religious authority has become a form of political power in the post-imperial world. The evening's entertainment reflects the cultural synthesis that characterizes the bishop's household. Classical poetry is recited alongside Christian hymns. Traditional Roman musical instruments accompany barbarian songs, and storytellers blend biblical narratives with folk tales from Germanic tradition. The entertainment serves not merely as amusement, but as a means of cultural exchange and diplomatic communication, allowing guests from different backgrounds to share their traditions while finding common ground in their shared humanity. The discussions often extend late into the night as the participants explore questions that have no easy answers. How should Christians respond to the collapse of the political order that had provided them with security and prosperity? What obligations do they have to preserve classical learning and culture? How can they maintain their religious principles while adapting to new political realities? These conversations reveal the intellectual ferment of the post-imperial period, as educated people struggled to understand their place in a rapidly changing world. The bishop's role as host requires him to balance competing demands and conflicting loyalties. He must maintain his authority as a religious leader while showing respect for the temporal power of his barbarian guests. He must preserve Christian orthodoxy while remaining open to theological dialogue. He must protect the interests of his Roman constituency while acknowledging the new political realities created by barbarian rule. His success in managing these tensions determines not only his own survival, but the future of the Christian communities under his care. The physical environment of the villa itself becomes a metaphor for the broader cultural transformation taking place throughout the former empire. The classical architecture provides a framework that continues to shape daily life, but that framework has been adapted and modified to serve new purposes. The pagan frescoes remain on the walls, but they are interpreted through Christian eyes. The formal gardens maintain their beauty, but they also serve practical needs. The ceremonial spaces continue to host gatherings, but those gatherings serve different social and political functions than they once did. The villa's library represents another aspect of this cultural transformation. The The classical texts that line its shelves are not merely preserved as historical curiosities, but continue to be read, studied, and applied to contemporary problems. The bishop draws on Cicero's rhetorical principles when composing sermons, uses Plato's philosophical frameworks to understand Christian theology, and applies Roman legal concepts to ecclesiastical administration. The classical tradition survives not as a museum piece, but as a living intellectual resource that continues to shape thought and action. The household's daily prayers take place in spaces that were once dedicated to pagan worship, but the continuity of sacred space creates a bridge between old and new religious traditions. The regular rhythm of prayer provides structure and meaning to daily life, while the communal nature of worship creates bonds that unite household members across social and cultural divisions. The prayers themselves blend biblical language with classical literary techniques, creating a form of worship that speaks to both the educated and the simple. The economic arrangements that sustain the villa reflect the transformation of Roman society from a money-based to a largely barter-based economy. The bishop's income derives not from imperial salaries or commercial investments, but from agricultural production, tithes, and gifts from wealthy supporters. He must manage his resources carefully, balancing his own household's needs against his obligations to provide charity to the poor, support for the clergy, and hospitality to visitors. His success as an administrator directly affects his ability to fulfill his spiritual responsibilities. The defensive preparations that have been made around the villa reveal the insecurity that underlies even the most privileged lives in the post-imperial world. The walls have been strengthened, the gates have been reinforced, and hiding places have been prepared for valuables in case of attack. The household maintains weapons and trains in their use, though they hope never to need such preparations. The bishop himself has learned to balance his Christian commitment to peace with the practical necessity of self-defense in a world where violence is an ever-present threat. The relationships between the villa and the surrounding countryside illustrate the complex web of dependencies that have replaced the formal administrative structures of the Roman Empire. The bishop serves as patron to numerous smaller landowners, providing them with protection and advocacy in exchange for loyalty and support. He mediates disputes between neighbors, arranges marriages between families, and coordinates agricultural activities that require community cooperation. His authority derives not from imperial appointment, but from his demonstrated ability to serve the needs of his community. The training of young clerics who live at the villa represents an investment in the future of Christian civilization. These young men receive not only theological education, but also practical training in administration, diplomacy, and leadership. They learn classical literature alongside biblical studies, understanding that their future effectiveness will depend on their ability to communicate with both educated Romans and barbarian rulers. They participate in the villa's daily life, observing how Christian principles can be applied to the practical challenges of governance and community leadership. The villa, his relationship with other Christian institutions, creates a network of communication and mutual support that spans the former empire. Messengers regularly arrive with letters from bishops in Gaul, Spain, and Africa, carrying news of theological developments, political changes, and practical innovations in church administration. The bishop reciprocates by sharing his own experiences and insights, contributing to a collective effort to maintain Christian unity and orthodoxy in an age of political fragmentation. The women of the household, though often overlooked in historical accounts, play crucial roles in maintaining the villa's complex social and economic functions. The bishop's sister, a widow who has dedicated herself to religious life, manages the household's charitable activities and supervises the education of young women who seek religious instruction. The wives of visiting dignitaries participate in their own networks of communication and mutual support, sharing information about conditions in their home regions and negotiating arrangements for trade and cooperation. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life provide a framework for the villa's activities that connects its inhabitants to the fundamental patterns of human existence. The spring planting involves not only the villa's own fields, but also coordination with neighboring estates, creating opportunities for community cooperation and mutual assistance. The summer growing season brings concerns about weather, pests, and disease that affect not only agricultural production, but also the villa's ability to fulfill its various social and religious obligations. The autumn harvest becomes a time of celebration and thanksgiving, but also of careful calculation about how resources should be allocated for the coming year. The villa's workshops and craft areas reflect the increasing self-sufficiency that has become necessary in the post-imperial economy. Skilled artisans produce the textiles, pottery, metalwork, and woodwork needed for daily life, while also creating the religious objects required for Christian worship. The bishop encourages innovation and excellence in these crafts, understanding that the villa sees for quality goods enhances its economic position and provides additional resources for charitable activities. The process of conversion among the villa's barbarian guests creates ongoing theological and pastoral challenges. The bishop must distinguish between sincere religious conviction and political calculation, while also providing appropriate instruction and support for new converts. He must address the syncretic tendencies that lead barbarians to blend Christian beliefs with their traditional religious practices, while also showing sensitivity to the cultural differences that make complete cultural assimilation impossible. The villa's role as a center of learning extends beyond formal education to include the practical knowledge needed for survival in the post-imperial world. Visitors learn about agricultural techniques, craft production, diplomatic protocols, and administrative procedures that can be applied in their own communities. The bishop encourages this sharing of knowledge, understanding that the survival of Christian civilization depends on the ability of its leaders to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential values and commitments. As night falls over the villa, the day's activities wind down with evening prayers that bring the entire household together in worship. The prayers themselves represent a synthesis of different traditions. Latin hymns sung by Roman members of the household, Germanic chants contributed by barbarian guests, and biblical psalms that speak to the universal human experience of seeking divine guidance in times of uncertainty. The diversity of voices creates a harmony that suggests the possibility of unity amid difference, of peace amid conflict, of hope amid despair. Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we're going to walk together through one of civilization's most gradual and devastating endings, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But this isn't a story of dramatic battles or thunderous speeches. Instead, imagine yourself settling into the slow, inevitable decline of a world that had stood for over 1,000 years. As you listen to these words, allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that the struggles we'll explore tonight are centuries behind us. You're safe in your modern world, wrapped in the security that our ancestors could only dream of. Tonight, we'll visit a time when that security was crumbling, grain by grain, like ancient mortar falling from weathered walls. The Roman Empire didn't collapse in a single day, as the saying goes. It died the way old things often do, slowly. Then suddenly, with those living through it, barely noticing the change until it was far too late. Picture an enormous tree, its roots deep and strong for generations, but gradually weakening beneath the soil. The leaves might still catch the sunlight, the branches might still sway in familiar patterns, but beneath the surface, something fundamental is giving way. You wouldn't have survived this collapse, not as the person you are today, shaped by modern expectations and comforts. The very qualities that make you successful in our contemporary world would have made you vulnerable in those final, desperate decades of Roman rule. Your trust in institutions, your expectation of tomorrow resembling today. Your assumption that money holds value, and that those in power actually control what they claim to control. All of these reasonable modern assumptions would have been dangerous luxuries in the dying days of Rome. The leader of the group, a sun-weathered man with Germanic tattoos, peeking above a Roman officer. His cloak catches sight of you anyway. He doesn't threaten, exactly. Instead, he offers a nod that carries its own weight. It's the acknowledgement that you both understand the new rules of survival. You nod back, carefully, and continue walking when they've passed. This is how civility works now. Small negotiations between strangers who share the knowledge that civilization's promises are no longer guaranteed. As you make your way toward the market, you reach automatically for the leather pouch where you keep your coins. The gesture has become a nervous habit, this checking and rechecking of what little wealth you possess. The coins themselves tell the story of Rome's decline in miniature. Your grandfather's denarii were silver, substantial things that rang with authority when dropped on a merchant's scale. Your father's coins were already debased, mixed with cheaper metals that gave them a dull sound and lighter weight. Now, you carry coins that barely qualify as money at all. The silver content has been reduced so drastically that merchants weigh them rather than count them. Some refuse them entirely, preferring to barter for goods or services. The emperor's profile on these coins looks cramped and uncertain, as if the engravers themselves were unsure who would be ruling by the time the coins entered circulation. You've learned to carry a mixture, some official currency for those who still pretend the system works, and some Germanic silver pieces for those who've moved beyond pretense. At the baker's stall, you witness a transaction that would have been unthinkable in your youth. The baker, a third-generation Roman whose family has fed this neighborhood for decades, examines a customer's coin with the suspicious eye of a money changer. He bites it, weighs it in his palm, and finally shakes his head. "Not today," he says quietly. "Not unless you have something else." The customer, a woman about your age, wearing a patched but once fine stola, reaches into her cloak and produces a small ceramic oil lamp. It's beautifully made, decorated with a scene of dolphins that speaks of better times. The baker examines it with more interest than he showed the coin. "This will get you 2 loaves, he decides. "Small ones." You watch her face as she weighs the decision. 2 loaves for a piece of her household's history. In the end, she nods and makes the trade. As she walks away with her bread, you notice she's crying quietly, not from hunger, but from the accumulated weight of all the small surrenders that survival now requires. Your own turn comes, and you're prepared. You've brought grain from your small suburban plot, not much, but enough to supplement what you can afford to buy. The baker knows you, has known your family for years, and this personal connection has become more valuable than any currency. "How are the roads out your way?" he asks as he measures your grain. It's not small talk. Information about which routes are safe, which tax collectors are operating where, which barbarian groups are moving through. This kind of knowledge keeps people alive. "Quiet this week," you tell them, "but there were fires to the north. Someone said it was tax collectors who got too ambitious." You don't need to elaborate. Everyone understands that the line between legitimate taxation and outright robbery has grown very thin. Imperial tax collectors, when they appear at all, often seem less interested in funding the government than in funding themselves. The baker nods and gives you slightly more bread than your grain strictly merited. This is how communities survive when larger systems fail through small kindnesses, and the understanding that today is favor might be tomorrow as lifeline. "Be careful on your way home," he adds. There were strangers asking questions yesterday. Well-dressed strangers. Well-dressed strangers asking questions. This could mean anything: imperial agents looking for tax evaders, barbarian scouts assessing the neighborhood's wealth, or local strongmen deciding which properties might be worth claiming. In a functioning state, strangers asking questions might simply be travelers or merchants. In your world, they represent potential threats that must be evaluated and avoided. You make your way home through streets that grow emptier as the day progresses. The afternoon siesta, once a pleasant Roman custom, has taken on a defensive quality. People retreat indoors not just for rest, but for safety. The hours between midday and evening have become the domain of those who operate outside normal social boundaries. Your house, when you reach it, shows the same adaptations as everything else in your world. The windows that once looked out onto a peaceful street are now shuttered and barred. The small garden where your wife once grew flowers for pleasure now grows only food. And even that is carefully hidden behind walls that have been built higher than they used to be. Beauty, you've learned, is a luxury that draws unwanted attention. Inside, your family gathers around a meal that would have seemed impossibly meager to your grandparents, but represents success in your current circumstances. The bread is dark and coarse, mixed with barley to make the wheat stretch further. The wine is watered, not from custom now, but from necessity. The olive oil, once used generously, is portioned out drop by precious drop. But you eat together, and there's warmth in that. Your children have never known the abundance of earlier generations, so they don't mourn what they've never had. To them, this is simply how life works. You listen to them chatter about their day-small adventures in the neighborhood, new words they've learned from the barbarian children, games they've invented that don't require toys or equipment. Their adaptability both comforts and saddens you. They're learning skills your generation never needed. How to read the mood of armed strangers. How to make friends with people whose loyalties remain uncertain. How to find joy in circumstances that would have broken their great-grandparents' hearts. They're becoming something new, not quite Roman in the old sense, but not barbarian either. They're the future, shaped by necessity into forms you couldn't have predicted. As evening falls, you secure your home with the careful attention of someone who has learned that safety is never guaranteed. The heavy bar across the door, the shutters latched from within, the small cache of valuables hidden in a place you pray no one will think to look. These precautions have become as routine as washing your hands, part of the rhythm of life in a world where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Before sleep, you and your wife speak quietly about tomorrow's challenges. Should you risk a trip to the larger market across town, where prices might be better but dangers certainly greater? Is it worth trying to contact your cousin in Ravenna, where the imperial court supposedly still functions? Should you begin teaching the children more Germanic phrases, just in case? As summer deepened in that fateful year of 476, the political machinery of Rome continued its motions with the mechanical persistence of a water clock whose reservoir had long since run dry. In the imperial palace at Ravenna, far from the ancient Seven Hills, a boy named Romulus Augustulus prepared for what would be his final audience as Emperor of the West. Imagine yourself in the corridors of that palace, walking on marble floors worn smooth by centuries of imperial feet, breathing air thick with the weight of ending. The irony of his name would not have been lost on those who still remembered their history. Romulus, after the legendary founder of Rome. Augustulus, Little Augustus, a diminutive that acknowledged both his youth and his powerlessness. His subjects had given him another nickname, one whispered in markets and taverns, Mammalus, Little Disgrace. But there was no malice in it, only the weary recognition that this child bore responsibility for failures far beyond his making or mending. You might picture him as the emperors of old draped in purple, surrounded by the elaborate ceremonies that had once awed barbarian ambassadors and Roman senators alike. But the reality of Romulus Augustulus was far more humble and far more tragic. At perhaps 16 years of age, he possessed the title of the most powerful man in the Western world, yet controlled little beyond the walls of his residence. The purple he wore had faded to the color of dried wine, the gold thread in its weaving tarnished by years of reduced imperial resources. On this particular morning, let us say it was early September, when the Italian air carries the first hints of autumn's approach, The young emperor sat in his private chambers, staring out at gardens that had once hosted the diplomatic receptions of his predecessors. The gardens were still beautiful, maintained by servants who continued their duties more from habit than from any assurance of payment. Roses bloomed along carefully tended paths, their scent drifting through windows that no longer looked out upon an empire, but upon a world in transition. His tutor, an elderly Greek named Marcellinus, sat nearby with a scroll spread across his lap. For months, their lessons had grown increasingly theoretical. What point was there in studying the administration of provinces that no longer acknowledged Roman authority? Why memorize the names of legions that existed now only in bureaucratic records? Yet they continued, teacher and student, bound together by the comforting fiction that education still mattered, that there would be a future in which this knowledge might prove useful. "Tell me again about Diocletian's reforms," Marcellinus requested, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had asked this question many times before. It was not really about Diocletian anymore. These lessons had become a form of meditation, a way of maintaining connection to a world that made sense, where cause and effect followed predictable patterns. But young Romulus was distracted this morning. Through the garden windows, he could see movement that didn't belong to gardeners or servants. Armed men in the distinctive armor of Odoacer's forces were taking positions around the palace grounds. Not threatening, exactly their manner was too casual for that. They moved with the confidence of people who knew they belonged wherever they chose to be. The sight of them reminded the boy emperor of a lesson his father had tried to teach him, that power wasn't about what you claimed to control, but about what others allowed you to control. His father, Orestes, had been a practical man who understood the realities of their situation better than most. Once a secretary to Attila the Hun, he had learned to navigate the complex relationships between Romans and barbarians that now defined European politics. When he placed his son on the imperial throne, it wasn't out of ambition for the purple itself, but from a calculation that having a Roman emperor, even a powerless one, might provide some stability in an increasingly chaotic world. But calculations, however careful, couldn't account for the ambitions of men like Odoacer. The Germanic chieftain, who now controlled Italy, had grown tired of the pretense that his power derived from imperial appointment. Why accept the title of Foederatus, bound in theory to Roman authority, when he could rule in his own name? The fiction had become more burden than benefit, and Odoacer was a practical man who preferred clear arrangements to comfortable lies. The messenger arrived as Marcellinus was describing the tetrarchy, that ingenious system by which Diocletian had divided imperial responsibilities among 4 rulers. The symmetry of the old system seemed almost mockingly elegant compared to the crude realities of the present moment. The messenger was one of Odoacer's men, but he approached with courtesy rather than arrogance. This was not a conquest in the traditional sense. It was more like a business transaction that had been negotiated in advance. His Excellency Odoacer requests an audience with His Imperial Majesty. The messenger announced, using the proper forms, even as everyone present understood that this was less request than notification. Romulus Augustulus rose from his chair with the careful dignity that had been drilled into him since childhood. Whatever else failed, he would conduct himself as an emperor should. The great audience hall of the Ravenna Palace had witnessed many momentous occasions over the decades. Since the imperial court had moved there from Rome, Honorius had received barbarian embassies in this room. Valentinian III had held court here, surrounded by the elaborate ceremonial that reminded both Romans and foreigners of imperial majesty. Now, as Romulus Augustulus entered the hall for what would be his final imperial audience, the space seemed to dwarf the handful of people present. Odoacer waited in the center of the hall, but he had not presumed to seat himself on the imperial throne. That gesture of respect would have meant more if it hadn't been so clearly calculated. A barbarian king, for that's what he was, regardless of whatever Roman titles he might claim stood with the patient stillness of a man who knew that time was on his side. He was perhaps 40 years old, scarred by years of campaigning, his long hair braided in the Germanic fashion, but his clothing a mixture of Roman and tribal elements that perfectly represented the cultural fusion he embodied. Behind him stood a small group of his lieutenants, men whose names would soon replace those of Roman senators in the governance of Italy. They watched the proceedings with professional interest, studying the ceremonial forms they would need to understand if they intended to rule Romans as well as their own people. This was not a band of raiders sacking a city. These were administrators preparing to inherit a bureaucracy. The conversation that followed was conducted in Latin, Odoacer's accent marking him as a foreigner, but his grammar showing years of experience in Roman diplomatic circles. He spoke of the burdens of rulership, of the practical difficulties of maintaining order in Italy, of the need for clear authority in uncertain times. Every word was carefully chosen to minimize humiliation, while maximizing clarity about what was going to happen. The people of Italy require protection, Odoacer explained, his tone suggesting that this was a reasonable observation rather than a veiled threat. They need leadership that can guarantee their security, ensure fair taxation, maintain the roads and aqueducts that civilization depends upon. These are heavy responsibilities. Romulus Augustulus listened with the composure that had been trained into him, but those watching could see the understanding growing in his young eyes. This was not a negotiation. It was an explanation, offered as a courtesy, but not requiring his agreement. The forms were being observed, the proper respect shown to imperial dignity, but the substance had already been decided. His Majesty has borne these burdens with great dedication, Odoacer continued, despite his youth and the difficult circumstances he inherited. But perhaps the time has come to consider whether these responsibilities might be better carried by others, leaving His Majesty free to pursue a life more suited to his years and interests. It was elegantly phrased, this suggestion that an emperor might choose to abdicate. The fiction allowed everyone present to maintain their dignity while acknowledging reality. Romulus Augustulus could step down voluntarily as a thoughtful ruler concerned for his people's welfare. Odoacer could accept power reluctantly as a dutiful servant responding to necessity. The Romans present could support the transition as a reasonable solution to practical problems. The actual ceremony of abdication was surprisingly simple. There were no elaborate rituals, no dramatic speeches, no symbolic breaking of imperial regalia. Romulus Augustulus simply removed the imperial diadem from his head and placed it on the table between himself and Odoacer. The crown itself was not particularly impressive, a simple gold band set with pearls, far less elaborate than the jeweled masterpieces worn by Eastern emperors in Constantinople. But it had rested on the heads of men who commanded legions, who received tribute from kings, who shaped the destinies of millions. I return this to more capable hands, the boy said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. May it serve the people of Italy better than I have been able to do. Odoacer lifted the crown, studying it for a moment as if weighing its significance. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone present, he set it aside rather than placing it on his own head. This belongs to the emperor in Constantinople, he said formally. I will send it to Zeno with word that the West no longer requires a separate Augustus. One emperor is sufficient for the Roman world. This unexpected decision transformed the moment from simple usurpation into something more complex and historically significant. By refusing to claim the imperial title for himself, Odoacer acknowledged that he was not destroying the Roman Empire, but reorganizing it. The fiction of Roman unity could be maintained, even as the reality of barbarian rule was established. It was a masterstroke of political theater, satisfying multiple audiences while achieving the practical goal of consolidating power. The aftermath of this ceremony was marked by the same careful courtesy that had characterized the abdication itself. Romulus Augustulus was not imprisoned, executed, or even exiled in the traditional sense. Instead, he was granted a comfortable retirement in Campania, complete with a generous pension and the honorary title of comes. For a deposed emperor, it was a remarkably gentle fate testimony, both to Odoacer's political wisdom and to the boy's own lack of dangerous ambitions. As news of the abdication spread through Italy, reactions varied as much as the audiences receiving them. In Rome itself, many citizens responded with a mixture of relief and resignation. The pretense that distant Ravenna controlled their daily lives had been wearing thin for years. If Germanic rule meant more effective governance, protection from raiders, and maintenance of essential services, it might prove preferable to the increasingly hollow authority of imperial appointees. Among the Roman senatorial class, responses were more complex. Some saw opportunity in the new arrangement. Odoacer would need experienced administrators, and competent Romans might find themselves wielding more real influence under barbarian rule than they had enjoyed under the dying empire. Others mourned the end of a tradition stretching back centuries, even as they acknowledged that the tradition had become increasingly meaningless. The news reached Constantinople several weeks later, carried by swift messengers along routes that had once connected the two halves of the Roman world. Emperor Zeno received both Odoacer's formal submission and the Western imperial regalia with the complex emotions of a man who had gained theoretical authority over territories he could never hope to control. The Eastern Empire now stood as the sole heir to Roman tradition, but that inheritance came with the acknowledgement that half the Roman world had passed beyond direct imperial reach. In the churches of Italy, priests and bishops offered prayers for the new regime, with the pragmatic flexibility that had always characterized Christian adaptation to political change. If Odoacer proved to be a just ruler who protected the church and maintained civil order, his Germanic origins mattered less than his policies. The faith had survived the transformation from persecution to establishment under Constantine. It would adapt to rule by Christian barbarians if necessary. But perhaps the most poignant responses came from ordinary Romans who had grown up hearing stories of imperial glory from their grandparents. For them, the abdication represented not just a change of government, but the end of a world. The idea that Rome was eternal, that Roman citizenship meant something unique and valuable, that Roman law and Roman peace provided the foundation for civilized life, all of these assumptions now required fundamental reconsideration. Yet life continued with remarkable normalcy in the days following the abdication. Farmers still tended their fields, merchants still negotiated their trades, teachers still instructed their students. The complex machinery of daily existence proved more resilient than the political structures that had supposedly guided it. Perhaps this continuity was the most Roman thing of all the practical recognition that survival mattered more than symbols. That adaptation was preferable to destruction. Odoacer himself proved to be a capable administrator, governing Italy with a mixture of Germanic pragmatism and Roman institutional knowledge. He maintained the Senate, respected Roman law in disputes between Romans, and continued the essential public works that kept cities functioning. In many ways, his rule resembled that of the barbarian foederati who had been governing Roman territories for decades, but with the clarity of acknowledged authority rather than the confusion of divided loyalties. And so we reach the end of our gentle journey through one of history's most profound transitions. As you listen to these final words, perhaps already feeling the pull of sleep, take comfort in the vast distance that separates your warm, secure present from those uncertain days of 476 CE. The struggles we've explored tonight, the empty streets patrolled by strangers, the debased coins that bought less each day, the quiet ceremony that ended in empire all, of these belong to a world that exists now only in memory and imagination. You wouldn't have survived the fall of Rome, not as the person you are today. Your expectations of stability, your trust in institutions, your assumption that tomorrow will resemble today, these modern luxuries would have been dangerous in a world where survival required constant adaptation to changing circumstances. But in recognizing this truth, we also recognize something profound about human resilience. Those who did survive found ways to maintain dignity, love, and hope, even as their familiar world dissolved around them. The Roman citizens who lived through that transformation discovered strengths they never knew they possessed. They learned to find security in family bonds when governmental protection failed. They developed new forms of community when old social structures crumbled. They adapted their skills, their languages, their very identities to meet the demands of an uncertain future. In doing so, they became the ancestors of medieval Europe, carrying forward what was valuable from the classical world while embracing what was necessary from the barbarian cultures that had joined them. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your comfortable bed, protected by laws that function and institutions that endure, remember that this security is not a permanent feature of human existence, but a precious achievement built through centuries of struggle and adaptation. The Romans who walked those empty streets in 476 CE would marvel at the world you inhabit, world where empires rise and fall without destroying the lives of ordinary people, where knowledge is preserved in libraries that span continents, where the collapse of one system doesn't mean the end of civilization itself. Rest now, knowing that their struggles paved the way for your peace, that their adaptations made possible your stability, and that their courage, in the face of uncertainty, helped create a world where you can safely surrender to sleep, trusting that tomorrow will bring its own gentle possibilities. The fall of Rome is over. Your rest can begin.